Today we're going to be talking about the Electoral College. We're going to begin with a little bit of brief background on the Electoral College, including how it came to be, why it's such an important piece of our federal republic, and some of the more famous historical elections in which it's come into play. We're going to talk about a couple of the common arguments that people have made against the Electoral College, some things you may be hearing, especially as the presidential election now approaches. And then, as Colin said, we're going to talk about a couple of threats to the Electoral College, something that's sweeping the nation at the moment. So with that, always begin with a brief cartoon here, or an anecdote. This is just a tweet that was out there. This is why we have the Electoral College. Obviously, Taco Bell voted the best Mexican restaurant in the country. Just a little humor. So background. So what is the Electoral College? Obviously, it's the system in which we use to elect the president and vice president of the United States every 4 years. Every state is allocated a set number of electoral votes equal to the total number of representatives that they have to the House and the senators that they have. And that way, every state gets a minimum of 3 electoral votes per the 23rd Amendment adopted in the early 1960s, ratified in the early 1960s. The District of Columbia also gets 3 electoral votes. It's a state-driven process. Legislatures get to choose how electors are selected. There's nothing that says that legislatures have to adopt or allocate their electoral votes by popular vote, for example. States could, and early on when the Republic was first started, they often did not even use an electoral vote, a popular vote process. They could allocate them any way they choose to. Results from the states get transmitted to DC. Congress tallies those votes until we have a clear majority of electoral votes committed to one candidate. The Constitution provides the framework for how that vote is counted. What happens if no candidate gets a majority of electoral votes? We'll talk a little bit about this going forward. The constitutional basis for the Electoral College is in Article 2, Section 1. And there I just have the quote of how each state gets their electors. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 established the original mechanics for the Electoral College to elect the president and vice president. As it was originally designed, the Constitution said that each elector gets 2 electoral votes. They cast one of those electoral votes, or they cast them both for whoever they want to be the president and vice president. Whoever gets the most electoral votes became the president. Whoever got the second most electoral votes became the vice president. This worked fine early on when we had George Washington as president. He was elected unanimously twice. Of course, that, as we'll see in a minute here, that quickly needed to change due to circumstances of partisan politics, essentially. So the founders recognized the need to protect liberty. Our Constitution established a government that did just that. It seeks to limit the possibility of tyranny, namely tyranny of the majority, by using a system of checks and balances. It's why we divide power between the federal government and the states. It's why we divide power within the government between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. Initially, the people elected the House, the states elected the Senate, and the states elected the president. The 17th Amendment, of course, changed the way that senators were selected, moving from a legislative election in the states to a popular vote in the states. That's a subject for a whole nother presentation on a different day. But the Constitution was really a compromise between large states and small states. The structure of our government reflected the fact that we had a diverse array of states at the time of our founding, at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, and the form of government that it took reflected that. That compromise is especially reflected in the Electoral College. Rather than a popular vote or a straight selection by the states, the compromise was to let the states select, but to give bigger states a greater voice because they have more people. They get more electoral votes. The Electoral College is part of that separation of powers to make our Constitution strong. It protects the electoral process by decentralizing it and giving control to the states. It makes it very difficult, frankly, to steal an election on a nationwide basis. If you're going to be trying to commit vote fraud, you have to go into each individual state, really each individual precinct, and try to do it there. The Electoral College recognizes states as states in our federal republic. The people don't elect the president of the United States. The states do. It's designed that way purposefully. Every state every state except 2 are winner-take-all states. Nebraska and Maine set up their electoral votes based on districts within their states. The Electoral College, as I said, makes it very difficult to steal an election through vote fraud. It forces candidates to build broad coalitions throughout the various states. President Trump won a number of states that President Obama won, for example. States flip. There are no permanent swing states, for example. Over time, they change dramatically. The Electoral College, though, most importantly, protects against tyranny of the majority. The president is not elected by whoever gets a majority of the votes or even whoever gets the most votes in the United States. It's whoever gets the most electoral votes. As I said, at the first two presidential elections, George Washington was elected unanimously. It was no question that he would be, although technically in the first election, it wasn't truly unanimous. In New York State, their legislature had not been able to meet to actually allocate their electoral votes, so they never submitted any. And North Carolina and Rhode Island at the first presidential election had not yet ratified the Constitution, so they were not allowed to vote for the president of the United States. But of the 11 states that were eligible, including New York, only 6 of those used some form of popular vote to allocate their electoral votes. The result, of course, was George Washington being elected. Every elector cast one of their 2 votes for George Washington. When it came to the election of 1796, however, the third presidential election, John Adams, a Federalist, was elected president, received the most electoral votes. His political rival, or one of them, Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, was elected vice president. He received the second most electoral votes. It'd be like today if Donald Trump was president and Joe Biden was vice president. They simply didn't get along. They disagree significantly on policy. It really showed a flaw in the Electoral College system. It began discussions about potentially amending this process. In the election of 1800, the political parties that had formed essentially tried to put forward tickets on which they would elect to kind of get around the problem. The idea was that all of the electors for the Federalists would cast their vote for John Adams, and then all but one would cast their vote for Charles Pinckney, thereby assuring that if they won, their candidates would be president and vice president. The Democratic Republicans put forward a ticket of Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Jefferson and Burr, however, won the overall election, but they both received 73 electoral votes, whereas Adams got 65 and Pinckney got 64. John Jay received the 1 electoral vote from the elector who didn't vote for Pinckney, so that in their attempt to make him vice president. What we saw then was the House of Representatives, which has to have what's called a contingent election. So in the Electoral College, when there's a tie, as there was here, with both Jefferson and Burr receiving 73 votes, it goes to the House of Representatives. The House casts votes by state. So each state delegation has to get together and cast their electoral votes to choose one of the individuals who's tied here. In this case, it was Jefferson and Burr. There was a 36 ballots before Thomas Jefferson was elected president. Alexander Hamilton had something to do with Jefferson winning and cutting a deal, essentially, to ensure Aaron Burr was not made president, which certainly played into events later on in his life. Following the election of 1800, the 12th Amendment was adopted. The 12th Amendment sought to replace the original Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 procedure by which the Electoral College originally operated. So this change now required electors to cast 1 vote for president and another vote for vice president. It kept most things similar. So the majority of electors for president became president. If no majority, it goes to the House. Majority of electors for vice president became vice president. If no majority there, then the Senate selects from the top 2 electoral vote getters, 1 vote per Senate seat, though. So it's not by state in the Senate. This was first utilized in the 1804 presidential election, and it has been in place for every election since. Now we'll get into just a couple of the more contentious elections, I guess, in which the individual who ultimately ended up winning the presidency did not receive a majority or a plurality even of the popular vote. The election of 1824, you saw John Adams, Andrew Jackson, who got the plurality there with 41%, William Crawford, and Speaker of the House Henry Clay. After the election was held, there was no clear electoral vote getter there. You needed 131 to be elected president. Andrew Jackson had the most votes, but he didn't have a majority to become president. So it went to the House of Representatives. Because only the top 3 candidates move on to the House, Henry Clay was out. Henry Clay, as Speaker of the House, though, wielded a lot of control in who ultimately was elected president, and it was John Adams. Henry Clay ultimately would go on to serve in the John Quincy Adams administration, some of the earliest political theater, we could say. In the election of 1876, a truly infamous election, Rutherford B. Hayes was up against Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden won the popular vote. This is, so far as I know, the only time in American history when a candidate actually won the popular vote, got more than 50%, a majority of the popular vote, but was not elected president of the United States. In this case, there was a lot of there were a lot of individuals, or states, several states submitted two sets of results. One set of results, which purported to be for Hayes, one set purported to be for Tilden. A lot of the southern states in particular were doing this. Ultimately, there was a deal struck, if you can call it that, where Republicans essentially said, okay, if you agree to elect Rutherford B. Hayes, we will end Reconstruction in the South after the Civil War. So the Republicans kind of made a deal which allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to become president, but then pulled all federal troops out of the South. In 1888, here again, Benjamin Harrison received 47.8%. Grover Cleveland got more popular votes, but Benjamin Harrison had the electoral majority at 233. Of course, everybody here probably remembers the election of 2000, where George Bush and Al Gore were up against each other. Al Gore received more popular votes, but George Bush had more electoral votes and was ultimately elected president. And finally, the most recent election in 2016, where Donald Trump received 46% of the popular vote to Hillary Clinton's 48%, but Donald Trump received more electoral votes and was elected president of the United States. So our history is kind of dabbled with these types of elections where the electoral vote winner does not always match up with the popular vote winner. And as Alexander Hamilton said, just a great quote here, if the manner of it be not perfect, it is at least excellent. So kind of an acknowledgement that, hey, it's not going to be perfect, but it's the absolute best we can do. And with that, I'll move into a couple of the arguments that we hear against the Electoral College. There's a movement in the country right now where individuals are actively attacking the Electoral College, mainly partisans who don't like the outcome of the last election, essentially. But they argue it's undemocratic. They argue that it creates elections where only swing states matter. They argue that it allows someone to lose even though they receive the most votes in an election. And most egregiously, they call it a relic of the slavery era, somehow trying to tie the Electoral College to slavery. I'll just kind of take each of those in order really quick. So first, the argument goes the Electoral College is undemocratic. So they fail to recognize that this is we're not a popular democracy. We don't work that way. That's never how it was intended. Our government is filled with checks and balances to stymie some of the negative effects of pure democracy, namely a tyranny of the majority. It's why we don't elect federal judges, for example. We give them lifetime appointments to insulate them from that political process. We see what happens in other states that directly, or other nations that directly elect their head of government. Turkey, Venezuela, Iran, Zimbabwe, not exactly places that we want to model our government institutions after. So, if the charge is that it's undemocratic, I think the answer is that it's supposed to be. It's a way to elect our leader that insulates from some of what I would call the pitfalls, essentially, of a pure democracy. Second argument against it is that only swing states matter. Another common argument that we hear is that only these swing states are in play and get to decide who's elected president. This disenfranchises a large number of Americans, especially on the coast and some of these larger states who really don't get a say in who the president is. This argument largely comes from those coastal elites. We hear people in California and New York mad that because their states always seem to go to the same party of late, that we should eliminate the entire process. But it's important to point out that this was the same debate that essentially happened at the time our Constitution was ratified. It was small states versus large states. The question was, should we have a popular vote and focus only on the number of people who are voting, or should we, create a system whereby every state was guaranteed a say? They chose the latter. California used to be reliably Republican. Texas used to be reliably Democrat. The electorate changes over time. It will always change over time. Look at Wisconsin over the past 10, 15 years. I mean, we've seen ups and downs. It's pretty remarkable. So no party can really ignore any state for too long. Look at Wisconsin in 2016, what happened there. Certainly no I think the argument, if the argument here is that only swing states matter, the answer there is that, well, swing states are always changing and no swing state stays a swing state forever. Everything can change over time. One of the other charges that allows someone to lose even though they receive the most votes, I think there's a reminder that there isn't even a requirement in the Constitution to hold a popular vote. Most states, all states now do that, have a popular vote. But as I said, at the very first presidential election, a majority of the states that could actually elect the president did not use a popular vote system. So they would just have the legislature of those states allocate their presidential votes. But the purpose of the Electoral College is to not allow a majority or even a plurality to simply choose their leader, impose that leader on everyone else, and then move on. It requires whoever wants to be president of the United States to form a broad coalition that represents a number of minority interests and can bring all of those factions together to build the support necessary to build an electoral majority in order to obtain that office. This basically means that although California and New York run up the tally for one candidate, that candidate may not be elected if they're only focusing on California and New York. States like Wisconsin matter significantly. States like Minnesota, Iowa, these are states that don't have a lot of people, but play a big role in the electoral process explicitly because the Electoral College exists. Lastly, the argument that the Electoral College is a relic of the slavery era is a pretty easy one to debunk. At ratification, a number of the southern states were actually opposed to the Electoral College as an institution and idea. Also, during the ratification debate, nobody brought up that the Electoral College was created to protect slavery. It was never mentioned by anyone during ratification. Surely would have been if that was their motivation for it. And of course, the important point that the Electoral College contributed to ending slavery, since Abraham Lincoln received less than 40% of the popular vote, and nonetheless, he was still elected president, and we all know what happened shortly thereafter. Nationally, there's one large threat to the Electoral College right now, and that's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So this is an interstate compact. It's a movement being funded by some very wealthy individuals to lobby the states to change the way they award their electoral votes. So these individuals recognize that a constitutional amendment to eliminate the Electoral College is very unlikely. So what they do instead is they're trying to do an end run around that amendment process, and they're passing laws that say that in these states that say once whoever wins the popular vote on a nationwide basis, those states pledge to send their electoral votes to that individual. So it doesn't become effective until states with up to 270 electoral votes or more adopt this change. The idea being that as soon as 270 votes adopt this law, whoever wins the popular vote is elected president of the United States because there'd be 270 electoral votes to elect them. So far, it has been adopted by 16 states and the District of Columbia, representing 196 electoral votes. So there's 74 votes short of what they need right now to enact this. Colorado, which has 9 electoral votes, has a ballot initiative right now to get rid of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. That'll be on the ballot next week in Colorado. Legislation was introduced in Wisconsin to adopt it, but it hasn't really gone anywhere. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is there's a lot of problems with it. So nobody really knows who counts the votes. I mean, is there a national center who counts the votes? Do we just kind of assume that media tallies from the various states? How do we do this? There's no central authority that would be doing this. Who orders a recount if one is necessary? Some of the other problems would be what happens if a census occurs and then states in which the compact now possess less than 270 electoral votes in the future? What happens if states decide to withdraw if their desired candidate loses? For example, would California really allocate their electoral votes to Donald Trump if he won the popular vote? I don't know. This change would allow somebody with a bare plurality to win the presidency. So this would likely lead to a spike in candidates. You'd see more people running as an independent or a third party, because all you have to do is get most of the votes, the most votes, not most of the votes. You don't need to have a large majority. You just need to have more votes than the other guys out there. So the national popular vote as I said, seeks to bring out a change to the Constitution without amendments. It undermines the legitimacy of our presidential elections. It would ensure that states like Wisconsin would have no real voice in the electoral process, which really weakens federalism and it weakens our republic and Wisconsin's role in both. You know, the Electoral College is a key ingredient of the cake that makes up our federal government, and without that ingredient, the cake just wouldn't be very good. So, with that, I know I kind of zipped through a lot of that, but I'd be happy to take any questions that may have come up during it. Of course, you can also email me. My email address is on there. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have that way, or give me a call, or even reach out to me on Twitter.
All right, Lucas, we have one question so far. Feel free to please put your questions in the chat. I'm happy to put them to Lucas. But the first question is, can the Interstate Compact change the Electoral College? Doesn't it need a constitutional amendment? So that question, it would be, so even if they got to 270, would it still require a constitutional amendment? I'm guessing we could expect litigation on such a thing if it were ever to come. What's kind of your assessment of that process?
Yes. So the way that the compact itself is structured, it wouldn't. It's designed to get around the amendment process altogether, because the way the Electoral College works now is that the states themselves, on their own, with no federal oversight, get to choose how they allocate their electoral votes. So what the compact says is, hey, states, if you adopt this, you're agreeing that whoever wins the popular vote nationwide gets your electoral votes, regardless of how your state votes. So if Wisconsin were to join this, and let's say Wisconsin voted 100% for Joe Biden, but Donald Trump won the national popular vote, Wisconsin, despite the fact that no person in our state voted for him, would still allocate our electoral votes for Donald Trump under the compact. And that's allowed under the Constitution if the state law is set up that way. So one of the problems that's not to say there aren't constitutional issues with the compact. Interstate compacts require congressional approval. If they, and the Supreme Court has interpreted that to say that compacts which reduce federal power essentially need to have congressional approval. So I think that would certainly be litigated. It's something that constitutional scholars have weighed in on. It's kind of an interesting debate that's going on in some academic circles, but it's something that I would surely expect to see litigated if the national popular vote compact ever got a little closer even than it is now.
Anyone who's played the 270towin.com thing where you're trying to figure out who's going to win the Electoral College next week, it's always funny to note Maine and Nebraska, states that kind of divide their electoral votes. Are those just truly unique, or is there any national movement to more of this division of Electoral College votes, less winner take all?
Yeah, so they are the only two states that do it right now. Historically, though, there were states have done it across the board. So it was more popular in the past than it is now. For example, some states in the past set up electoral college districts within their state. So the state would say that they were going to have essentially voting districts where each district would be used to allocate their electoral votes. That was one way in which it's been done before. We see that a little bit in Maine and Nebraska, where they divide their congressional districts, use their congressional district lines for their electoral votes, and then they allocate.
Did we lose you, Lucas?
Their statewide voting approach in most states, but yeah.
And it seems, do you think the national popular vote is the biggest threat to the Electoral College right now? It seems like these controversies come and go typically in the wake of an election like we had in 2016 or 2000. Do you think if we have a clear Electoral College vote winner and a popular vote winner this time around, that some of these arguments will kind of die on the vine again because they won't be as relevant?
Yeah, certainly. We saw a resurgence in the national popular vote movement, obviously, after 2016 by certain partisans who weren't happy with the outcome. I would expect that if there's a clear winner of both the popular vote and the Electoral College this time, there won't be that same fire to push the national popular vote. As I also said during the presentation, Colorado has a ballot initiative to pull out of the national popular vote.
Seem to be having some connectivity issues.
it's something that could be, I apologize.
No, no worries. I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we will have a recording of this if you missed it or if you wanted to share it with someone. Thank you so much, Lucas, for your time.